You say the words Durell Software to most adults now who own the ZX Spectrum and to some extent an Amstrad CPC in its heyday, and you'll almost certainly get a reply fondly remembering one of their few but often classic game titles throughout the 80s. Commodore 64 owners? Yeah, not so much. But were the C64 games actually that bad? And if so, why? For a bit of background, let's go back to how things started out for Durell. Robert White very much wanted to be an art teacher, but at this time in his life, so did seemingly everyone else. In a 2010 article for Retro Gamer magazine, Robert remembers applying for one particular job and finding out it had 800 other people applying for it also. Maybe the art teacher's life wasn't for him. He did meet and marry his wife though while studying at art college, and it was his new father-in-law that suggested he try working in his current trade as a quantity surveyor. Although by the time he finished that particular degree, he was firmly against the idea of continuing this career path, but it did at least introduce him to computers, where the programmer seed was very much planted. He then applied for a job with the Oxford Regional Health Authority, where his mix of computer studies, quantity surveying, and art landed him the role, with the first task helping with the computer-based design of Milton Keynes District General Hospital nonetheless. Being the new boy, he was given the task of finding out why the building had twice the amount of kitchen work units that the architect knew they needed. Someone had got the floors and ceilings mixed up and put one lot of units on the ceiling. Someone else came along, noticed there was no units on the floor, and thus inadvertently added them and doubled them. He continued to work there for the next 3 years until after the unfortunate passing of his wife's grandparents, they had the opportunity to move into their old house in Taunton, which really wasn't crying out for hospitals to be designed. So he quit his job for the move. Computer bug firmly in place though, he spent what would be his startup capital on an Oric computer and set about trying to write some software to sell by mail order. The company name would use one of Robert's middle names, Robert James Durell White, and started with 2 arcade clones on the 16K Oric, Lunar Lander and Asteroids. Mail order sales went okay enough, but it came quickly apparent after the first few months that if he was going to do this properly, he was going to need more programmers to realise some of the ideas he had for new games. An advert was put out in a local newspaper for machine code programmers, which was duly answered by 2 new employees, Ron Jeffs and Mike Richardson. Ron Jeffs wasn't actually looking for a new job, his wife was, who noticed the advert and showed her husband. He applied, interviewed, and returned back home holding an Oric computer under his arm. Ron was an engineer by trade but had garnered an interest in programming after picking up a ZX80. Mike, although some 20 years younger than Ron, joined in a similar vein. Programming was a hobby outside of his chosen career path following his MSc in instrumental chemical analysis. Whilst working at an aerosol factory, Mike had been working on a Pitfall clone called Jungle Trouble, which, when shown to Robert, landed him the job at Durell. The pair's first task though was not anything they had to offer themselves, but a game idea based around the Harrier jump jet fighter that was getting lots of press coverage at the time because of the recent Falklands War.
He's gone down. Look, mate. Looking out.
Ron was given the Oric version to work on, and Mike the task to essentially port Ron's Oric version onto the ZX Spectrum. Even though the Commodore 64 was becoming fairly popular in its infancy in 1983, it wasn't even on the radar at this point. Scramble clones were fairly popular too, so by doing a Scramble type game but basing it on the very popular and news current Harrier seemed like a mashup that couldn't fail to Robert. So much so that he booked up to £20,000 worth of advertising for the game. By September 1983, when the game was ready to be shipped, the money pot at Durell was empty. If the game didn't sell, there was no way Robert could afford the booked advertising cost, so Durell could have quite easily disappeared before they'd started if Harrier Attack was deemed too close to the Falklands conflict and subsequently not gone down well with the buying public. And although some magazine reviews were a little sniffy towards its theme and the potential that you do a bombing run on Port Stanley, the 16K game sold by the bucket loads, surpassing 150,000 copies and single-handedly funding any Durell development costs up to the next 3 years. Sometime later, Mike quickly whipped up a port of the Spectrum version to the Amstrad, which, when compared to its predecessor, was pretty close. This was common for Spectrum to CPC ports, as it was relatively easy to clone games because both machines shared similar hardware architecture, particularly with the same Z80 processor, which meant a lot of the core game logic could be directly translated with minimal code changes. This made Mike an obvious choice in converting games over to the CPC, as he knew the Z80 very well. Fun fact time now about the AMSoft version. That was Alan Sugar being on the lookout for games to bundle in with his new home micro offering, and he struck up a deal with Robert to include Harrier Attack with a selection of AMSoft branded AMSoft games. Naturally, dealing with Mr. Sugar meant Durell didn't do particularly well out of it, with Robert suggesting they barely made 10p a copy, but it was nice to shift another 100,000 copies or so. The Commodore 64's popularity was getting harder to ignore though, but with no one with time to pick up a port to the Commodore 64 of Harrier Attack, a freelancer was eventually brought in to apply the get the games on as many platforms as possible strategy. The Commodore version was written, or ported should I say, by John Parkinson, who has no other C64 game credits it seems, and this is, well, quite a bizarre start. Firstly, the plane turning is very nice and something you cannot do on the original version, but the game is way too fast for its own good and you can just fly up high and get to the other side of town very quickly. The forest at the other end of town though turned out to be endless, which I didn't realise until I watched some gameplay videos to find out, and you seemingly have to turn round, bomb the town and return back to your original carrier rather than wrapping around again. Maybe a little bit more realistic for that part, and at least makes this version unique on its own, but honestly, even though the Spectrum one hasn't aged too well now, its 16K-ness blows this version clean out of the water. Mike's original game, Jungle Trouble, was then finished and also released for the ZX Spectrum, with Mike working full-time at this point instead of the original freelance agreement. Jungle Trouble, although fairly simple looking graphically and all contained within one screen, had rather clumsy controls that made even jumping across the pads at the bottom of the screen a challenge. It wasn't until I discovered that you needed to release left before pressing jump did I get anywhere. Apparently Durell got many returns on the game with players unable to even get our little man to jump. According to Mike, he wrongly assumed that as you stop running when you jump, you therefore should let go of the run key before leaping, which isn't a natural feel when playing a game as opposed to real life physics. What is apparent here though is Mike's talent for making nicely animated sprites, which was something that made his next game, Scuba Dive, all the more special. No CPC port for this one, probably deemed too simplistic looking, but once again oddly freelanced to someone with seemingly no other Commodore 64 experience to make what they could out of it, and yes, this is Jungle Trouble on the Commodore 64. Just look at that crocodile for instance. I'm not sure what else needs to be said, so I'll just leave you with a little montage of the game. Sticking with arcade game origins with a new spin, Robert wanted a Frogger game, and after some ideas meetings, the frog was replaced with a scuba diver, the traffic or obstacles replaced with fish, and the idea really grew from there that turned into a game more of an exploration one than an arcade one. Ron Jeffs, who was instrumental in the game design, went off and did the Oric version, and Mike set about on the ZX Spectrum one, which as it turned out was by far the best version of the game. 92% in Crash Magazine, 9 out of 10 in Sinclair User meant that popular magazines at the time also agreed. It's the graphics and their animations that really shone through though, getting 98% alone in the Crash review. With the excellent way the tentacles move on the giant octopus to the way the sharks turn in the water, it really made the game so much more immersive. For any 10-year-old playing, it really felt like a scuba dive adventure that with the scroll around flip screen gave the game an open world kind of feel. With what I've already mentioned, with Robert understanding that for a game to be a success it needed to be on as many platforms as possible, this was actually the first Durell game to feature on the Commodore 64 too. Again, with Ron busy on the Oric version and with Mike handling the Spectrum one, someone else needed to be brought in on a freelance basis to port the game to the C64. Nigel Dewdney was given the task, who, unlike others before him, actually worked on more than one Commodore 64 game. He in fact worked on 2 Durell games and nothing else, with the other being a game not to feature on anything else other than the Commodore 64 called Shades, which received a lowly 37% in the first ever Zap 64 magazine and was considered slow and clunky. With Scuba Dive on the C64, we have somewhat an interesting result though, going for an odd mashup between the Spectrum and Oric versions and pretty much failing at both. Examples being, whenever you jump off the boat, the fish resync to their starting positions. The whole thing is on one screen, and its poorly animated fish make the game feel very much closer to its Frogger origins. There's no fancy octopus here, unless you die in game, which I quite liked, but rather an annoying opening in the ground which can be tricky to get through. When you do, it looks a little bit more like the Spectrum version, but with far worse scrolling effects. Just look at what is happening to the high scores etc. on the right hand side when you move around. Often when comparing Spectrum against Commodore games, Spectrum games can be better just through gameplay alone. Very rarely are they better on graphics, and even rarer still are they better on both. It's a truly terrible port that is already showing that despite the Commodore 64's popularity, it was either quite hard to find solid programmers for it in the Taunton area, or Durell didn't look maybe that far afield, or Robert was giving anyone who showed a little promise a crack at the whip, and kind of failing. This might have been said of another freelancer that actually became full-time employed straight from school, called Simon Francis. While still doing his A-levels, he was trying to sell his Dragon 32 game Fiend, but Robert wasn't interested in the Dragon, but offered Simon some freelance work for a couple of CPC games instead. These turned out to be standard run-of-the-mill games, Roland Goes Square bashing anyone, but were enough to get Simon more work turning his Fiend game into Death Pit on the CPC. Whilst all this was going on, Mike and Ron were working on their next big release, yet again a complete change to what went before, with the helicopter game Combat Lynx. Mike stuck to the Z80 offerings of the Spectrum and CPC versions, and this time Ron had a go at the C64 version, as he had some experience of the 6502 on the Oric. So how did this game go down on the Commodore 64 then, compared to others now it was written in-house? Well, before that, if we start with Mike's original game on the Spectrum, it's pretty special for its time, but quite hard to work out what is going on now. The massive control options when you redefine keys don't help, but I did manage to get up and move around with ease, even though I had no clue where I was supposed to go. It did get a crash smash, unusually under 90%, and was ported by Mike to the CPC, which is where it seemed more at home, with the better use of colours, making it clearer as to where you were supposed to be in relation to the hills, houses, etc. Ron's Commodore version? Well, it went down okay. Again, the use of colours and lack of attribute clash made it nicer to look at than the Spectrum version, but it's very framey and kind of chugs along a bit, and the general consensus was that compared to the CPC version, it was something of a disappointment, but not terrible, so maybe they were finally onto something. Another fun fact time now, as this was the first Durell game to offer a £100 reward if you grassed up who supplied you your non-blue coloured tape. In the same Retro Gamer article, Robert admits it was all a bit of a hoax. They certainly weren't going to go around prosecuting kids, and no reward was ever paid out. As for the special blue tapes, it was just that their tape duplicator gave them a deal on some blue cassettes they had knocking about. Nothing more than that. Piracy was a problem, but the whole thing was all just a bit of a bluff. Combat Lynx also made it onto the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron, courtesy of another couple of freelancers, Nick Wilson and Julian Todd. Like Simon, they were eager to get a game they had made sold called Mineshaft for their Acorn and BBC Micros, but unlike Simon, they were successful in getting it published with Durell. To prove they were up to the job, they were given Combat Lynx to port to those systems, which they did over the weekends, frantically coding away in Nick's bedroom. At a similar time, another local school lad, Clive Townsend, was trying to sell his games at a shop nearby, who suggested he go and visit Durell and show them what he was up to. So it turned out that in the school holidays, he spent many days at Durell talking to other programmers and learning assembly language. Two of the coders were working on Death Pit, a reworked version of Simon's Dragon 32 game Fiend for the Amstrad and BBC Micros, and Robert asked Clive to make a Spectrum version. He was still learning assembly, so was never entirely happy with the end result, and I guess neither was Robert as it was never released, but it was a great stepping stone towards his first actual release game, based on an extremely popular ninja theme at the time, simply called Saboteur. This game was literally like nothing else when it came out for the Spectrum. The fantastic use of colour against our black cloth friend with other items to hide behind or step into like the train here was brilliantly done. With lots of difficulty levels, it remained a challenge even after at least escaping on the easiest settings. The fact you got to see the big helicopter on escape was cool, as were some of the small things in the game, like the way our Saboteur looked around when waiting or flung his arms up when dropping. This was a perfect blend of action, platform and puzzle. There was not much in the way of sound, and that might be one criticism, but in all honesty I think it added to the atmosphere of the game. Crash Magazine agreed, giving the game a Crash Smash Award status, as did Your Sinclair and Sinclair User. The CPC version is pretty much a direct port of the Speccy version, and I get that. It looks fantastic on the Spectrum, so why not use it as is? It does run quite a bit slower though, and is a little framey, which is a shame. You can see this clearly when looking at these two long play videos of the start sequence together. Now, framey is something you can't say about the C64 version though, that came out a year later as another freelance port. This moves at a tremendous pace, which is great, but it also looks like it's ported straight from the Speccy, which never really washed with Commodore users or Zap Magazine it seems. Although they did give it an above average score and commented that it was Durell's best offering so far, so maybe things are on the up. Released at a very similar time to Saboteur was another fledgling Durell programmer's first big game in Simon Francis's Critical Mass. On the ZX Spectrum, this won a crash smash and generally did well with other publications at the time also, praised for its, although often sparse, excellent detailed graphics and smooth scoring gameplay. It's quite nice that if your space shuttle blows up, you get a second chance as the little chap desperately trying to return to your home pod before getting eaten by the Dune-esque sandworms. Although it was suggested that a freelancer out of house would do the Amstrad port, as read here in Amstrad Action, it appears to have been the work of Simon Francis also, which is probably a fair assessment, as unfortunately it's just another lift and shift port of the Spectrum one. The Commodore version was considered another disappointment, and Durell's reputation for making Spectrum games certainly did not carry over to our breadbin cousins. The soundtrack is pretty bad, but I think the graphics are okay. I mean, they're quite clear and crisp, albeit all rather brown. But I think Commodore owners just expected more. Certainly Zap Magazine did when reviewing this in the March 1986 issue, giving it a very low 59%, despite the graphics getting over 80. Good graphics does not always mean a good game, is the moral of the story here, and sadly Ron's attempted port did not go down too well once again. It just seems that Durell really didn't have anyone on their books that could make consistently good C64 games. Now, you might be wondering what Mike was doing whilst all this was going on. Well, he was busy making the granddaddy of GTA with another ZX Spectrum classic called Turbo Esprit. One of the 50 or so games to get an award from each of the three big Spectrum magazines. Albeit in a very small window with lots of screen estate taken up by the dashboard, it's a fast-scrolling 3D environment that won praise everywhere. Whether you decided to drive around sensibly or just go nuts, it was all a thrill just to have the ability to roam as you please, all the while passing pedestrians, traffic lights, junctions, so on and so on. It's possibly a little bit more framey, but certainly an improvement on other CPC ports by Mike, with also Nick Wilson credited, and the Amstrad version does at least use the CPC's nice colour palette to its advantage, and got a rave review in Amstrad Action, although they did complain about the colour of the good and bad cars if using a green screen. They did though generally love this for the same reasons the Spectrum magazines did. And then There's the Commodore version. To say this is sketchy is an understatement. When researching this, I couldn't find anyone responsible for actually coding it, and the reviews seemed to be non-existent until the Encore release some 3 years after. To give you an idea how bad this actually is though, the re-release got 9% in Zap magazine, with the maximum score being 58% in the more generous Commodore user. The roads just go on and on with nothing happening, literally no traffic. The cars are tiny and the controls are horrendous. This was the new low for Durell and cemented their crap status now on the Commodore 64. By 1986, things were getting tougher in the game publishing market. To keep with the Durell mantra of pushing out unique but good games and keeping up with the competition, games were taking longer and longer to make to keep up with everyone else. For example, Turbo Esprit took 10 months to make, and Durell, unlike some other software houses, didn't put too much pressure on programmers to get the games out. This often led to better, more polished games. And this directive on how to make great games carried on to the next game by Mike, the bizarre but beautiful dragon game, Thanatos. Graphically, I think this was Mike's pinnacle, with the fantastically large dragon-type creature at your control. There really was nothing like this that moved and played like this on the market at the time. Spectrum magazines loved it. Crash Smash again, 4 out of 5 in Sinclair user, and 9 out of 10 in your Sinclair. It was another port as is to the CPC, which actually seemed to go down quite well also, so surely the C64 version did better this time. Well, yet again it's ported by someone without any other games listed, and like Turbo Esprit, wasn't reviewed by the main magazines until budget re-release. Now would that be because no review copies were sent out to the magazines, or the magazines were just not interested in reviewing Durell games in the first place? Your Commodore did eventually review the Encore release in 1990 and gave it 58%, which seems a little low if you read the review, where they said it was quite good fun flying about as a dragon doing dragon stuff. Reading players' reviews though on Lemon 64, and yep, the same reasons crop up. It's done better elsewhere, it's slow, boring, dull, blah blah blah. Some more attempts, and some not at all attempts, were made with Nick Wilson's Deep Strike that once again didn't get a full price review for the seemingly average Commodore version. Nick seems to be credited everywhere for this one, which is unusual but at least consistent, as it was fairly average on the ZX Spectrum and CPC ports also. At the same time, the most bizarre name for a game, legend has it came to Robert's wife in a dream or something, Fat Worm Blows a Sparky by Julian Todd, you remember the other half of the BBC Micro duo with Nick Wilson, was a Spectrum only game with quite a disturbing front cover that still freaks me out randomly today. I'm not sure why. Anyhow, this 3D top-down maze affair where you control a worm was critically placed by the magazines at the time, but didn't venture outside of the specky walls. Saboteur 2 was inevitable after the success of the first one and finally got released in 1987 on all 3 systems. Once again, it avoided magazine reviews for the full-price Commodore 64 release until the budget one, where its top score was 81% in Commodore user, which was pretty good. The problem here was the Commodore players weren't massively enamoured with the first one. It did okay, but still looked like a straight specky port, which wasn't enough for some. Saboteur 2 was bigger with more stuff to do, hang gliding, bikes, flamethrowers, and a lovely Ron Hubbard soundtrack included on the 128K Spectrum version as well. But even on its home system, it certainly felt a little bit more framey than the first one and slightly less fun to play. This was possibly conveyed in the scores the magazines gave the specky one, that dipped behind the first outing but was still decent enough to suggest it was still a good game. I'm sure if you were a fan of the first game, you would have most certainly got something out of the second one. Same applies for the CPC version. It plays quite slowly, but probably gave everyone the sequel they sought after. So well done, Clive. Fun fact time again, I came across this high score table in Saboteur 2, which appears to be some random codes. After asking for help in a ZX Spectrum Facebook group, Jonathan South came to my rescue and discovered that the codes were actually serial numbers or IDs to music albums. I won't give away what is on the list, you can work that out if you want to, but I do want to know if Clive still listens to this, if he ever plays Saboteur 2. And finally, we have two games that bucked the trend somewhat with Durell, I presume because Nick Wilson and Ron Jeffs were both programmers that were used to the 6502, and maybe the same applied to Deep Strike. But these two looked to have come out first on the Commodore 64. Ron Jeffs' Sigma 7 and Nick Wilson's Chain Reaction. Starting with Chain Reaction first, seen here on the Commodore, this didn't do very well in the few magazine reviews it got, citing its rather bland, repetitive nature, with most of the rooms looking pretty much the same. Interestingly, the Spectrum port was done by another new face, a Danish chap called Mads Spork, who is also credited in the Amstrad port also, but all to little fanfare though. And that brings us on to Sigma 7, which outside maybe a little love shown Saboteur's way, has gamer comments on it saying things like, "It wasn't a bad game actually," or "I rather like this." Zap kind of agreed with a better than most 70% score, which seemed a little underscored when you read the review about the nice mix of minigames within the game. This was to be Mike's last game with Durell with the Spectrum port that did about as well as the Commodore one, although your Sinclair rather liked the 3-in-1 games element, so much so that they gave it quite good marks. A nice conversion to the CPC was also done by Mike, with a nice use of the colours at least, which also went down as a good way to spend some of your time affair on the CPC. But, in truth, all in all these later games started to show cracks in the Durell mantra. For the ZX Spectrum at least, Durell prided themselves on producing nothing but quality titles, but with stiff competition and longer time needed to keep up with everyone else, it all became too much for Robert, who was looking for a way out. Each game could quite easily cost anything up to 80,000 quid to produce, and the financial risks were becoming a heavy burden on Robert. It was at this point that he just couldn't sleep at night, so he made the decision to stay in the software business, but not the games one. He sold the rights to Durell's games to Elite, who were looking to expand their budget range, and forged ahead with software for the insurance business, which is proudly something the company still do today. And that says a lot really, as how many 8-bit software companies survived those early years. But saying all that, I'd still love to know what the deal was with Durell and its relationship with the Commodore 64. Was it purely around not just having the right talent? Or just wanting to concentrate on the ZX Spectrum with everything else being a little bit more of an afterthought? I mean, a lot of the CPC games were just straight ports. Either way, they did make some great games that unless you loved everything beige, you will still fondly remember even today. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all on the next one. Bye for now.